Slowly, as the prayers grew louder, Amani began to inch towards the back of the room, pulling Waridi gently along with her. Her eyes darted around the room, making sure none of the guards were watching. She reached the back door, her hand trembling as she grabbed the handle. Suddenly, a loud voice rang out from the front. "Where are you going?" Amani froze. Her heart stopped as she turned to see one of the guards glaring at her. The entire room had gone silent, all eyes now fixed on her and Waridi. I was just... Amani stammered, trying to think of an excuse. Pastor Adonijah smiled, though there was no warmth in it. "Come forward, Sister Amani. Join us in prayer." Amani had no choice but to obey. She returned to her spot with Waridi, her plan to escape shattered. Fear gripped her as she realized just how trapped she was. The door to freedom had been within her grasp, but now it felt further away than ever. Tension in the air thickened after Amani's failed escape attempt. She could feel the eyes of the guards on her throughout the night, watching her every move. Waridi seemed unsettled too, her usual playful energy replaced with nervousness. The next day, Pastor Adonijah announced that there would be a special ceremony that night. His tone was filled with an eerie excitement, and Amani's gut told her that whatever was planned would not be good. "They are planning something," one of the women whispered to Amani when they were alone in the room. "Tonight is different." Amani felt a shiver run down her spine. "What do you mean?" "I don't know, but usually when they take someone..." Amani's heart sank. She couldn't let that happen. She had to find another way to escape, but every plan she thought of seemed impossible. The guards were everywhere, and the compound was locked down tight at night. That evening, Amani stood in the hall with the others, her hands gripping Waridi tightly as Pastor Adonijah began the ceremony. His voice was more intense than usual, and the women around Amani seemed to be caught in a trance, swaying to his chants. Suddenly, Pastor Adonijah stopped chanting and raised his hands. "Tonight, we welcome a new sister into the fold. Step forward." Amani's blood ran cold as she saw one of the women from the group step forward, her face blank, her eyes unblinking. The others began to chant louder, their voices blending into a strange airy hum. Amani felt like her chest tightened. This wasn't a church service. This was something else entirely. The woman knelt before Pastor Adonijah and he placed his hand on her head, muttering words Amani couldn't understand. Then the guards moved forward, taking the woman by her arms and leading her out of the hall. Amani's heart pounded in her chest. Was this what happened to the women who disappeared? Waridi tugged on her sleeve, her small voice filled with worry. "Mama, what is happening?" Amani knelt down, pulling Waridi close. "Don't worry, baby. I won't let anything happen to us." But deep down, Amani knew that they were running out of time. She had to escape. But how? Desperation was starting to overwhelm Amani. The more time she spent in Pastor Adonijah's church, the more she realized that this was not a place of salvation, but a trap designed to keep its member under complete control. The next morning, after the strange ceremony, Amani noticed something peculiar. As she wandered the compound with Waridi, pretending to go about her normal routine, she spotted one of the older women speaking to a guard in a hushed tone. The woman glanced around nervously before leading the guard towards a narrow alley that ran alongside the main building. Amani's curiosity piqued. Could there be a way out through there? That night, when everyone was asleep, Amani made up her mind. She couldn't wait any longer. If they stayed, she feared what would happen during the next ceremony. With Waridi asleep beside her Amani carefully slipped out of bed and made her way to the narrow alley she had seen earlier. She found a small passage hidden behind a row of bushes leading to the back of the compound. It was dark and cramped, but Amani could see that it led somewhere beyond the wall. Her heart raced. Could this be a way out? As she inched forward, a hand suddenly grabbed her from behind. Amani gasped, spinning around to find one of the women standing there, her face pale in the moonlight. "You can't leave," the woman whispered urgently. "They will catch you." Amani's chest tightened with fear. "I have to try. I can't stay here." The woman shook her head, glancing around nervously. "There's no escaping this place. Once you are here, you belong to Pastor Adonijah. He sees everything." Amani swallowed hard. The woman's words confirmed her worst fear. But as she stood there, she realized something else. She wasn't the only one who wanted to leave. As the tension mounts, Amani discovers a potential ally in her quest to escape. But can they trust each other? Will they find a way out? Or will Pastor Adonijah's terrifying grip tighten further? The woman's words echoed in Amani's mind. Pastor Adonijah sees everything. But she couldn't just give up. She had to escape, not just for herself, but for Waridi too. Her mind raced as she faced the woman standing before her, wondering if this stranger was a friend or a foe. "What is your name?" Amani asked quietly. The woman hesitated before responding, her voice barely above a whisper. "My name is Nneka." Amani could sense the fear in Nneka's eyes. It was the same fear that had been haunting her since the day she stepped into the church compound. There was something about Nneka that made Amani believe she wasn't fully loyal to Pastor Adonijah. "Have you tried to leave before?" Amani asked, trying to gauge whether Nneka could be trusted. Nneka nodded, her eyes darting around to make sure no one was watching. "I did once, but I was caught. Pastor Adonijah knows everything that happens here. The guards found me before I could get far." Amani felt a lump form in her throat. It seemed there were no secrets in this place, no way to hide from all-seeing eyes of Pastor Adonijah. But still, Amani pressed on. "Why are you still here then? Why haven't you tried again?" Nneka lowered her voice even more. "Because I can't do it alone. No one can escape this place on their own. The last woman who tried disappeared, and no one ever saw her again." Amani's heart skipped a beat. She had heard about the disappearances, but now it felt more real. If she didn't act soon, she might be the next one to vanish without a trace. But the idea of having Nneka as an ally gave her a small glimmer of hope. "I'm not staying here," Amani said firmly. "If you want to leave too, we have to do it together." Nneka hesitated for a moment, fear flashing across her face, but after a long pause, she nodded. "I will help you, but we need to be more careful. Pastor Adonijah has eyes everywhere." Amani took a deep breath. She was putting her trust in a stranger, but it was a risk she had to take. Together, they would plan their escape, this time without getting caught. Over the next few days, Amani and Nneka observed the compound, studying the guards' routine and looking for any weakness in the church security. Waridi remained Amani's top priority, so she had to be discreet. If Pastor Adonijah or the guards suspect anything, they wouldn't hesitate to separate her from her daughter. One evening, while pretending to join the other women in prayer, Amani noticed something strange. Two of the guards were whispering to each other at the back of the hall, their eyes scanning the crowd as if they were looking for something or someone. Amani kept her head low but listened closely to their conversation. "Did you hear about the women who disappeared last month?" one guard said in a harsh tone. "Yeah," the other replied. "Pastor Adonijah said she was purified, but I heard she was trying to leave." Amani's blood ran cold. The word purified took on a chilling new meaning. It seemed that anyone who tried to escape was dealt with swiftly under the guise of religious rituals. The women who vanished weren't just running away, they were being silenced. Amani's mind raced. She had to find a way to use this information. But how? Every step she took was being watched, every move monitored by the guards and Pastor Adonijah. After the prayer session, Amani whispered to Nneka, sharing what she overheard. Nneka's face grew pale. "We need to move fast," she said. "If they suspect we were planning something, we will be next." That night, as Amani sat with Waridi in their small room, her daughter spoke in a soft voice. "Mama, I don't like here. The ladies are scary, and the guards don't smile." Amani pulled Waridi close, stroking her head. "I know, my love. We won't be here much longer, I promise." But deep down, Amani knew that the clock was ticking. Every day they stayed, the risk of being caught increased. She had to act soon, or she might lose her chance forever. Waridi looked up at her mother with wide, innocent eyes. "Mama, I had a dream. A man with a big heart was chasing us, but we hid under a big tree and he couldn't find us." Amani's heart skipped a beat. Waridi's dream sounded eerie familiar to the tall, imposing figure of Pastor Adonijah. Was it just a child's imagination, or was it a warning of what was to come? As Amani pondered Waridi's words, she made a decision. She couldn't wait any longer. She and Nneka would have to make their move, even if it meant risking everything. Amani and Nneka met in secret that night, under the cover of darkness. The guards were less attentive at night, which gave them a small window to discuss their escape plan. "We can't go there through the main gates," Nneka whispered. "They are heavily guarded, and the guards will soon sound the alarm if anyone tries to escape." Amani nodded. "What about the passage near the alley? Could we slip through there?" Nneka shook her head. "I checked. It's blocked off now. Pastor Adonijah must have heard about your attempt." Amani's heart sank. Every possible route seemed cut off, but Nneka wasn't finished. She leaned in closer, her voice barely audible. "There's one other way, through the basement." Amani frowned. "The basement?" Nneka nodded. "Is where they keep the supplies for the ceremonies. I've seen some of the guards go down there late at night. There's a tunnel that leads out of the compound, but no one knows about it except a few of the inner circle." Amani's eyes widened. A secret tunnel? It sounded almost too good to be true, but if it was real, it could be the only way out. "How do we get to the basement without being seen?" Amani asked. Nneka glanced around nervously. "I've been watching the guards' routine. There's a shift change at midnight, and for a few minutes, no one is stationed near the basement door. That's when we go." Amani felt a surge of hope. It was a dangerous plan, but it was the only way they had now. All they had to do was wait for the right moment. Will Amani and Nneka manage to sneak into the basement and find the secret tunnel, or will their plan be foiled by Pastor Adonijah's ever-watchful eyes? The stakes are higher than ever, but their determination to escape grows stronger with each passing day. The night of the escape had arrived, and Amani could feel her heart pounding in her chest as she sat beside Waridi, waiting for the right moment. Waridi, unaware of the danger around them, had fallen asleep, clutching her mother's arm. Amani gently kissed her daughter's forehead, whispering a silent prayer for their safety. Nneka had instructed Amani to meet her by the basement door at midnight. They couldn't afford to be late. Timing was everything. Amani felt a surge of anxiety, knowing that if anything went wrong, they could both be captured or worse. The compound was unusually quiet that night. Amani watched the clock, waiting for the seconds to tick by. The gas shift change was fast approaching, and she knew she had to act now. Carefully, she lifted Waridi into her arms, wrapping her in a blanket to keep her warm. "Stay asleep, my love," Amani whispered as she tiptoed towards the door. Amani glanced around one last time before she stepped out into the corridor. The dim lights cast airy shadows on the walls, but she kept moving, her footsteps light and quick. Her heart raced as she neared the basement where Nneka would be waiting. As Amani approached the basement door, she saw Nneka standing in the shadows, her eyes wide with anticipation. Amani gave her a small nod, signaling that it was time. Just as Nneka reached to the door handle, they heard footsteps approaching. Amani's heart jumped into her throat. The shift change wasn't supposed to happen for another few minutes. Someone must have decided to patrol earlier. Nneka froze, her hand hovering over the door. Amani quickly pulled Waridi close, her mind racing for solution. If the guard spotted them now, it would all be over. "Quick, hide," Nneka whispered urgently. They darted behind a stack of crates near the corner, crouching low to avoid detection. The footsteps grew louder, and Amani held her breath, breathing that the guard would walk past without noticing them. Waridi stirred slightly in her sleep, but Amani held her tight, willing her to stay calm. The guard's flashlight flickered across the wall, illuminating the basement door for a brief moment. Amani's heart pounded in her ears as she watched, helpless from their hiding spots. Time seemed to stretch on forever, but finally the guard continued down the hallway, disappearing around a corner. Amani exhaled slowly, relief flooding her chest. They had narrowly avoided disaster. Once the guard was gone, Nneka didn't waste any time. She swiftly unlocked the basement door and they slipped inside, closing it quietly behind them. The air in the basement was cold and damp, the smell of mold and dust filling the small space. It was darker than Amani had imagined, and the faint light from the hallway barely penetrated the room. Waridi stirred again, and Amani gently rocked her back to sleep. Nneka led the way, using a small flashlight to guide them through the maze of supplies and boxes stacked against the wall. "The tunnel should be at the back," Nneka whispered. Amani followed closely behind, her heart pounding with a mix of fear and hope. She knew that this was her last chance. If the tunnel was blocked or guided, there would be no turning back. After what felt like an eternity, they reached the far wall of the basement. There, hidden behind a large wooden shelf, was a narrow trapdoor. Nneka bent down and slowly lifted the cover, revealing a dark passage leading underground. "This is it," Nneka said, her voice barely audible. "Once we go through, there is no coming back." Amani swallowed hard. The tunnel looked cramped and suffocating, but it was their only way out. She took a deep breath and nodded. "Let's go." Nneka went first, lowering herself into the tunnel and disappearing into the darkness. Amani hesitated for a moment, then carefully passed Waridi down to Nneka before climbing in herself. The tunnel was as tight and claustrophobic as it looked, but Amani forced herself to keep moving. The tunnel was long and winding, the air heavy with the smell of earth and decay. Amani crawled through the tight space, trying not to think about how deep underground they were. The sound of her own breathing echoed in her ears, mixing with Warida's soft snores. "How far does this go?" Amani whispered to Nneka, who was ahead of her. "Not too far," Nneka replied. "It should lead us to the other side of the compound. From there, we will be free." "Free?" The word hung in the air, giving Amani the strength to keep pushing forward. Her arms ached, and her knees were cramped raw from the rough ground, but the thought of escaping Pastor Adonijah's grip kept her going. Finally, after what felt like hours, Nneka stopped. "We are here," she whispered. Amani crawled up beside her, squinting in the darkness. Ahead of them was a small rusted metal door. Nneka reached out and carefully pushed it open, revealing a faint silver of moonlight on the other side. "This is it," Nneka said. "We are outside the compound." Amani's heart leaped with hope. They had made it. She could see the open air beyond the door, the trees swaying gently in the night breeze. Freedom was just a few steps away. But as they prepared to step out of the tunnel, they heard a sound that froze them in place. Voices. Guards were approaching from the direction of the compound. Amani's pulse quickened as the voices grew louder. They were so close to escaping, but if the guards spotted them now, everything would be ruined. Nneka looked at Amani, her face pale with fear. "We have to move," Nneka whispered. "Now." Amani clutched Waridi tightly as they crawled out of the tunnel, making their way towards the trees. The moonlight cast long shadows on the ground, and the faint sound of the guards' footsteps echoed behind them. They had to make a choice: run now and risk being seen, or wait for the guards to pass and hope they weren't discovered. The voices of the guards grew louder, their footsteps crunching on the gravel path just a few meters away. Amani's heart raced as she clutched Waridi close, hiding in the shadows of the trees. Nneka gestured for them to stay still, her finger pressed to her lips. "We have to wait," Nneka whispered, her eyes wide with fear. "They are too close." Amani nodded, her body tense with anticipation. She could feel the cold air against her skin, but her mind was too focused on their escape to notice the chill. Waridi stirred in her arms, and Amani prayed that she wouldn't wake up and make a noise. The guards walked past their hiding spots, talking in low voices. Amani held her breath, her heart pounding so hard she feared they might hear it. Every second felt like an eternity as the guards' flashlight beams swept across the trees, dangerously close to her hiding place. Finally, the guards' voices began to fade as they continued down the path. Amani exhaled softly, relief flooding her chest, but they couldn't relax yet. There was still a long way to go before they were truly safe. "Now," Nneka whispered urgently, "we have to go now." Without hesitation, they began to move, creeping through the trees as quietly as they could. The compound walls were still in sight behind them, and Amani knew they had to put as much distance as possible between themselves and the church before anyone could notice they were gone. The night was eerie quiet, the only sound being their hurried footsteps and the occasional rustle of leaves. Amani's arm ached from carrying Waridi, but she didn't dare slow down. Every step felt like a step closer to freedom, but also a step closer to being caught. Just when Amani thought they had put enough distance between themselves and the church, they heard something that made their blood run cold. Barking. The guards had released the dog. Nneka's eyes widened in panic, and Amani's heart sank. They were close to the road that led out of the compound, but the sound of the dogs meant the guards knew someone had escaped. They had to move faster or they would be found. "We have to run," Nneka hissed, her voice trembling. Amani's legs were weak from exhaustion, but she didn't hesitate. She tightened her grip on Waridi and started running as fast as she could. The trees blurred around her as they dashed through the forest, their footsteps pounding against the dirt. The barking grew louder, and Amani knew the dogs were getting closer. Her lungs burned from the effort, and her arms ached from holding Waridi. But she couldn't stop. Not now, not when they were so close to getting away. Suddenly, Nneka stopped and grabbed Amani's hand, pulling her towards a small clearing. "This way," she whispered urgently. "We can hide here." Amani followed her, ducking behind a large bush and crouching low. The barking continued, growing louder and louder until it seemed the dogs were right on top of them. Amani's heart pounded in her chest as she held her breath, hoping the dogs wouldn't pick up on their scents. For a few agonizing moments, they waited in silence, the tension almost unbearable. The dogs barked and growled nearby, but then, just as suddenly as they had come, the barking began to fade. The dogs were moving away, following a different trail. Amani exhaled in relief, her body shaking from the adrenaline. They had nearly escaped being caught again. Just when Amani thought they were safe, Nneka's face grew pale. She looked behind them, her eyes wide with terror. Amani turned, and what she saw made her heart stop. Standing at the edge of the clearing, bathed in the moonlight, was Pastor Adonijah himself. His dark eyes gleamed with an unsettling calmness. His smile sent chills down Amani's spine. He had found them. "I told you," he said in a voice that was too calm for the situation. "No one leaves this place." Amani felt frozen in place, her body unwilling to move, despite the fear that coursed through her. Waridi stared in her arms, her small voice whispering, "Mama." Pastor Adonijah stepped closer, his presence looming over them like a dark shadow. Nneka stepped in front of Amani, her body trembling but her voice steady. "We are not going back," she said, her eyes locked on the pastor. The pastor's smile widened. "You think you can escape?" His voice was low, almost a whisper. "No one escapes from me." Amani's mind raced. Her thoughts jumbled with fear and desperation. How had he found them? How was he here so quickly? And more importantly, how were they going to get away? The pastor raised his hand, and Amani felt a cold wave of fear wash over her. She had heard stories about Pastor Adonijah, about his strange powers, about people disappearing without a trace. Was that what was about to happen to them? Just as the pastor took another step forward, the sound of siren filled the air. Amani's heart leaped in her chest. Police, could it really be? Pastor Adonijah's smile faltered, and for the first time, Amani saw a flicker of fear in his eyes. He turned towards the sound, his calm demeanor crumbling. Amani didn't wait to see what would happen next. She grabbed Waridi and bolted towards the road. With Nneka right beside her, the siren grew louder and Amani's heart raced with hope. Has someone reported the charge? Was help finally here? But as they reached the road, Amani's relief was short-lived. A row of black vans blocked the street, and men in dark uniform stepped out, their faces hidden in shadows. Amani's blood ran cold. These weren't the police. They were part of Pastor Adonijah's security. She had been wrong. The nightmare was far from over. The black van loomed ahead, and Amani's legs felt like they were going to give out. Men dressed in dark uniforms advanced towards them, moving with airy precision. Nneka clutched Amani's arm, her face pale with fear. "Those aren't police," Nneka whispered, her voice trembling. Amani's stomach churned with dread. They had run right into a trap. The men from the van formed a tight line, blocking any chance of escape. Behind them, Pastor Adonijah emerged from the shadow, his eyes locked on Amani and Waridi. "Did you really think you could run?" he said, his voice cold and full of disdain. "You are mine now." Warida whimpered in Amani's arms, her small voice barely audible. "Mama, I'm scared." Amani held her daughter tighter, her mind racing for solution. There had to be a way out. There had to be. She looked around desperately, but there were no gaps in the line of men, no way to break through. Nneka suddenly stepped forward, placing herself between Amani and the advancing men. Her hands shook, but her voice was firm. "You don't own us. We won't let you control our lives anymore." Pastor Adonijah's smile returned, but it was devoid of warmth. "Oh, you misunderstood, Nneka. I don't control your lives. I control your souls." At his words, the men began to close in. Amani's heart raced, and she realized with horror that they were surrounded. The moment felt like it stretched for an eternity. Amani's mind flashed with images of her life before this nightmare, before the abuse, before the cut. She remembered the joy she had once felt, the dreams she had for her daughter Waridi, and now everything seemed to be slipping away. Pastor Adonijah's voice cut through her thoughts. "There is no escape. The sooner you accept that, the easier this will be." Amani's chest tightened. She could feel Waridi trembling in her arms, and it broke her heart. How had things gotten this bad? She couldn't let this be the end for them. Tell us where you are watching from, because it will help us to know when to post another story. And if you like this story, write escape on the comment section.